Imagine being 10 years old, loaded into a carriage, and dispatched across the gray mountains of northwestern Hungary like a piece of cargo, not as a guest, not as a visitor, but as property. A child, formally betrothed, traded between two powerful families like a diplomatic asset. The mountains around Castle Csejte are the kind that make everything beyond them feel like it stopped existing. And for the girls who would later pass through those same gates, it actually did. For centuries later, Elizabeth Bathory is a Halloween costume, a band name, a horror film villain, the woman who bathed in the blood of 650 virgins to stay young forever. That number gets repeated so often it feels like settled fact. It isn't. And the actual story underneath the legend is stranger, more political, and more disturbing than anything the Gothic imagery ever captured. But you can't understand what happened at Csejte without first understanding what it meant to be a Bathory. Her name was effectively her armor. With an uncle on the Polish throne and a cousin ruling Transylvania, Elizabeth wasn't just wealthy, she was legally untouchable. In that world, the rules that existed for ordinary people genuinely did not apply to her. That wasn't arrogance. It was just how the 16th century worked. It was also a family with a documented darkness running through it. Tight dynastic marriages, cousins marrying cousins across generations, had compounded whatever instability existed in the bloodline. Elizabeth's brother was known for violent, unpredictable behavior, while her Aunt Clara, by multiple period accounts, openly enjoyed tormenting the servants in her household. Whether Elizabeth absorbed any of this by inheritance or simply grew up in a world where cruelty toward powerless people was so routine it became invisible, history can't cleanly resolve that. What it can say is that she came of age in a household where people with power did whatever they wanted to those without it, and nothing ever happened to any of them because of it. That was the atmosphere she was raised in, the only version of normal she ever knew. She married Ferenc Nadasdy in May 1575, 15 years old, in a ceremony that was really a political alliance wearing the clothes of a wedding. Ferenc spent most of their marriage fighting the Ottoman Empire, earning the title Black Knight of Hungary for his ferocity on the battlefield. He was, by the accounts that survived him, also someone who brought that appetite home. Stories, contested but persistent, describe him teaching Elizabeth methods of punishing servants that went well beyond anything that could reasonably be called discipline. Whether those accounts are accurate or were manufactured later to explain where Elizabeth's cruelty came from, they tell you something important about what daily life in that castle looked like. Violence wasn't hidden there. It was practiced openly, on people who had no one to complain to. Ferenc died in January 1604, after a slow illness that had been pulling him down for years. He was 50. Elizabeth was 43, and now she was something the royal court hadn't quite had to reckon with before. One of the wealthiest landowners in Hungary, a widow, operating without a male figurehead, accountable to no one in her immediate household. In a court that had complicated feelings about that kind of independent female authority, that visibility made her a target in ways she may not have fully appreciated. The rumors had been circulating for years before that. A Lutheran minister named István Magyari had been lodging formal complaints since at least 1602, 2 years before Ferenc's death, claiming that girls were going to Csejte and not returning. He brought those complaints to the church. He brought them to the royal court. For years, almost nothing happened. The reality was much colder than that. The girls who were disappearing were servants and peasants, daughters of families with no standing to force accountability from a countess. In 16th century Hungary, you didn't drag a Bathory into a proceeding over a missing serving girl. You just didn't. The social divide between the nobility and everyone beneath them wasn't merely financial. It was closer to the distance between two different categories of human being under the law. Then, in 1609, Elizabeth got careless. She had been untouchable for decades because she had only ever targeted people who didn't matter to anyone with power. But that year she opened what amounted to a finishing school at Csejte, offering to take in daughters of lesser nobility and gentry to educate them in the refinements of court life. 25 girls came from families with just enough standing to matter. Several of them died or disappeared, under circumstances their families absolutely refused to accept quietly. These weren't peasant families who could be dismissed. They had connections. They had voices that reached the king directly, and they used them. King Matthias, too, had his own reasons to pay close attention. Elizabeth's estates were among the largest in the kingdom, and the crown owed her late husband's family a substantial sum of money it had never repaid. An investigation that ended in Elizabeth's ruin would resolve that debt with remarkable convenience. He commissioned Georgi Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, one of the most powerful officials in the kingdom, to find out what had been happening at Csejte. Thurzo's team spent months gathering testimony. More than 300 people were deposed: servants, local villagers, clergy, minor nobility. And here's something that usually gets smoothed over in the retelling. Depositions in 1610 were not collected under conditions we'd recognize as fair. Witnesses were questioned under intense pressure. Some were already imprisoned. Some understood very clearly that giving the wrong answer had consequences. That doesn't mean everything they said was invented. It means their words need to be read as what they actually were. Statements gathered by investigators who had already decided what the answer should be and were looking for confirmation. What those testimonies described, even accounting for that pressure, was still deeply disturbing. Girls brought to the castle and subjected to prolonged abuse. Bodies buried in the churchyard at Csejte. When the churchyard ran out of space, bodies scattered in the fields beyond the walls. Enough consistency across enough different witnesses that the core of the story, serious, sustained violence against young women inside those walls, is genuinely hard to dismiss. Then there was the journal. The single most cited piece of evidence against Elizabeth Bathory is a journal, allegedly written in her own hand, that supposedly listed the names of 650 victims. This journal has never been physically located. It has never been independently examined by anyone outside that investigation. It exists entirely in references made by the men who were already building the case against her. That number, 650, the one that appears in every headline, every Wikipedia opening sentence, every most prolific female serial killer in history claim, rests entirely on a document no one outside that room ever confirmed was real. Let that number sink in. On December 30th, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Csejte Castle with armed men. The official account states that he walked in and caught Elizabeth in the immediate aftermath of a killing, a dead girl on the floor, another dying nearby. His own correspondence from the weeks prior reveals that he and the king had essentially agreed on the outcome before that night ever happened. Whether the scene he described was genuine evidence or a staged conclusion to a predetermined verdict is something historians have been arguing about for 300 years. What followed was revealing. Elizabeth, technically, wasn't imprisoned after that night. She was confined, which sounds gentler until you understand what it actually meant. Her rooms were bricked shut from the outside. The windows were sealed. Food was pushed through a slot in the wall. All contact with the outside world was severed. She was never granted a trial, never formally sentenced, never publicly executed. Under Hungarian law, a noblewoman of her rank couldn't be processed through the courts the way a commoner could, and the king apparently had no appetite for the formal charges a real trial would require him to prove in front of witnesses. Her 4 accused accomplices had no such protection. They were tried and convicted, and they met the full, terrifying weight of 17th-century justice, ends that made Elizabeth's walled rooms look almost merciful by comparison. For the next 3.5 years, those 4 sealed walls were Elizabeth's entire world. The official record says she died of natural causes on August 21st, 1614, which is a polite way of saying she was left to fade away alone in the dark, and that for the king and the court, her death was a relief. She was buried at Csejte, but local residents petitioned to have her moved, and her remains were eventually transferred to the Bathory family crypt in Nyírbátor. Whether those remains are genuinely hers has never been confirmed. After her death, the Hungarian authorities ordered her name suppressed, not turned into a public warning, not made into a spectacle, just silenced. She spent the next century existing mainly in village whispers around Csejte, a name people said quietly and didn't elaborate on. Then 1729 arrived. A Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Tarazzi published a historical account drawn from the original trial documents, and added, for the first time in a widely circulated text, the detail that became her permanent identity. Elizabeth Bathory had bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth, a claim introduced more than 100 years after the events it described, with no corroboration in any record from her own lifetime. By a writer working from documents about a woman who had been dead for over a century and couldn't correct him. That detail spread faster than any verified fact ever had. By the 19th century, she was appearing in Gothic literature across Europe. By the 20th, she was the template, the aristocratic female monster, the beautiful killer, the woman who murders to cheat time. The reason we keep telling the bloodbath story isn't because it's true. It's because it's the kind of horror story we've been trained to expect from powerful women. That version of events turns an ugly, political mess into a simple cautionary tale about a woman's vanity. It's an easier story to tell. It's just a lot less honest. A woman who stepped outside the boundaries of what she was supposed to be, who accumulated wealth and authority and operated without male oversight. The story that survived wasn't about class violence or judicial corruption or a king quietly erasing a debt. It was about vanity, about a woman so obsessed with her own reflection that she murdered hundreds of girls for their blood. And in doing so, it completed a transformation that started the moment Thurzo bricked up those rooms. It took the girls who disappeared, the ones whose families had no standing, no names anyone recorded, no mechanism to demand justice, and turned them into props, background figures in someone else's legend. We started with a 10-year-old girl being treated like a piece of property. In the end, the myth of the Blood Countess did exactly the same thing to her victims, traded them away, quietly, in exchange for a better ghost story. The one thing we know for certain is that girls died at Csejte Castle. The woman who likely killed them has a legacy that has lasted for centuries. The girls she killed didn't even get to keep their names. That's the real horror of Csejte Castle.